going to ask Andrea if she'll introduce our guest tonight.
A very big thank you to Vicky Smallman. She's the Director of Human Rights at the Canadian Research, Education and Violence and Harassment in the World for the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. Vicky also volunteers for Equal Voice, advocating for women in Canadian politics, tracking federal political parties' progress in nominating women candidates. Vicky has pursued a PhD in English and is the mother of 2 wonderful children.
Thank you, Andrea.
Over to you, Vicky.
Thank you, Andrea, and everyone for having me here today. I'm really happy to be joining you, and I hope that I'll offer you some things to reflect on. Maybe we'll, and there should be some time for questions and discussion, I imagine, and given the discussion that happened right before this, I'm sure that we'll be able to have lots to talk about. So International Women's Day, while it has become a fairly mainstream event celebrated by governments, corporations, the media, has pretty radical origins. It was first conceived at an international socialist women's conference in Europe as a day in which women around the world would press for their demands for equality and justice. And the first International Women's Day saw rallies across Europe calling for women's rights to work, to vote, to be trained, to hold public office, and calls to end discrimination. About a week after this first observance, which was in 1911, there was a very tragic fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City. And it took the life of about 140 women who, worked under very horrible conditions and were actually locked in the building by their employer and were not able to get out. And this, this really sort of sparked a series of protests and actions, a whole movement for labor rights and justice and equality that is really at the heart of what International Women's Day is today. Not too long after the Triangle Shirtwaist fire was the famous Bread and Roses strike in the United States. So a time of considerable mobilization for labor rights, and women were at the heart of it. And women in the labor movement have a long history of mobilizing for equality in the world of work and in our communities. We've got maternity and parental leave because postal workers went on strike in the 1970s for paid maternity benefits. And now everybody has access to that through our employment insurance system. So, at the CLC, we really try to honor the original focus of International Women's Day by using the event to push for action to address systemic barriers to gender equality. 3 years ago, on International Women's Day, the Canadian Labour Congress launched a new campaign on women's economic justice. With a government that had declared itself to be feminist, we felt like it was a time to see or to press for real concerted action around 4 key pillars: ending sexual harassment and violence, fixing the childcare crisis, ending wage discrimination, and making work fair for women. And we called our campaign Done Waiting because, well, quite frankly, a lot of these things have been on the agenda of the women's movement for a very long time. And we wanted to really sort of, bump up the edginess a little bit and put some pressure on this government that was openly talking about how it wanted to make a difference for women's rights. So our goal for the Done Waiting campaign was to show how these barriers impact different women in different ways, and to push solutions that would make a difference for the women and the workers who face the biggest obstacles to economic security. So we wanted to show, that harassment and violence, while it impacts all women, there are groups of women that experience this barrier very differently. They higher proportions of violence and harassment, more barriers to support. For example, Indigenous women, as you all know, experience much higher death rates than missing and murdered Indigenous Indigenous women phenomenon or crisis has really been well documented. Women who are immigrants or who are trans, for example, might face barriers to getting access to shelter services and other types of supports because of barriers, because of stigma, because of discrimination. So we wanted to show how all of these different issues affected different groups of women in different ways, but that solutions could be found that would really make a difference for the most vulnerable. Now, in the 3 years that's happened since the Done Waiting campaign launched, we have made some progress, but we never anticipated that a global pandemic would not only risk the few gains we've made under the current government, but the gains women have made in the last 3 decades. Make no mistake, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on women's jobs and women's livelihoods, and especially on the jobs and livelihoods of Black and Indigenous women, women of color, and on women with children and lone mothers. Women were hit hard by the initial shutdown, with low-wage workers, who are a highly racialized group, particularly affected. Over half, that is 58% of all female workers earning less than $14 an hour, were laid off or lost the majority of their hours between February and April. Almost 60%. That is devastating. By the end of April, 2.8 million women, that's 30% of those working, had lost their jobs or reduced their work time. And yes, there's been some recovery since then, but it's been slower and it hasn't been equitable. Black women, women of color, Indigenous women have not recouped the losses as quickly as white women have. And the gains have been pretty precarious. According to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, progress in employment rates has stalled since the summer, and the total number of hours worked has fallen. So the number of long-term unemployed women has more than doubled. One reason for the gender disparity in job loss is that the sectors most affected by the shutdown employ large numbers of women, transportation and tourism, for example. The other factor is caregiving obligations. Many women had to reduce working hours in order to care for children or other family members, to make up for schools and childcare services and other care services that were closed. Over 1/3 of single mothers with kids under 12 lost their jobs or a majority of their hours when the economy shut down. And by August, many were still unemployed or working less than half time, including 42.2% of mothers with kids under 6. So women bore the brunt of the job losses, but they've also been on the front lines of the pandemic, doing the work that keeps our communities healthy, safe, fed, and supported. But the work in these essential or so-called essential sectors is often invisible, undervalued, and unrecognized, marked with poor working conditions, exposure to violence and harassment, and other health and safety risks. And while there was an initial boost with pandemic pay and emergency childcare set up for essential workers, these initiatives have not lasted well into now that we're getting into the second year of this pandemic. The pandemic brought many of these realities to surface and brought new or greater risks and inequities, such as a higher risk of exposure to COVID-19 for these workers, who are mostly Black and Indigenous women, women of color, migrants, and recent immigrants. Unlike other countries, women make up the majority of diagnosed COVID-19 cases in Canada, and more women than men have lost their lives. We also know that women have not benefited equally from the gradual reopening of the economy. And again, the most marginalized are the most impacted. And a key reason for the slow recovery is women's unpaid work caring for children and family members. The pandemic has placed many women in an impossible position. And for many, something had to give, and it was their job. Women's labor force participation has been set back more than 30 years. 30 years, imagine, right? 30 years of progress, and now we're back to the beginning. Unless we address some profound structural barriers, recovery from what many have dubbed the she-cession will be long and difficult. Governments have an opportunity and a responsibility to map out a gender-responsive recovery aimed at restoring women's labor force participation, creating decent jobs, narrowing the gender wage gap, and reducing and redistributing unpaid care work, and investing in our social safety net to help sort of protect us from future disasters. A feminist recovery would center the needs of those most impacted and ensure no one is left behind. It would include a jobs plan that invests in the sectors where women work and in services that women and families rely on. That is the caring economy. Care is a vital part of Canada's social infrastructure and an economic generator. Quality public services and social infrastructure like childcare, elder care, and other social services create decent jobs, and help boost labor force participation overall by reducing the burden of unpaid care work. There was a recent study by the Center for Future Work that estimated that a universal national early learning and child care program would create over 200,000 direct jobs in child care centers, 100,000 more jobs in industries which support and supply the sector, and it would facilitate increased labor force participation and employment by up to 725,000 Canadian women in their prime parenting years. And by the end of a 10-year implementation, it would grow the GDP by between $63 and $107 billion. That is incredible, right? Extra government, and then not only would it grow the GDP, it would also provide more tax revenue for all levels of government, perhaps up to $29 billion to government coffers per year, thus paying for itself and more. Which is pretty incredible, right? Now, of course, childcare advocates have known this and have been saying this for many, many years. But now, fortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, the pandemic has really sort of exposed the need for childcare, but it has also allowed for a conversation about the benefits of childcare. And now you have banks, business leaders, many more voices calling for universal childcare than we did previously. So it's really allowed us to kind of flip the script a little bit about how we talk about childcare and other types of social services. We used to talk about them as a drain on the government coffers and as an expense, as opposed to an investment, right? And so what it does is it allows us to kind of move away from this austerity-driven approach, this market-driven approach to the delivery of care, to something that shows that it really that is an important investment in social infrastructure that can be to help strengthen our communities and get people to work. I should probably reflect a little bit on harassment and violence, given the conversation that we had before I started speaking. And I will say that harassment and violence, unfortunately, remains an incredible what the UN has called a shadow pandemic, right? Except that the shadow pandemic didn't really start when COVID-19 does. It just sort of exposed a kind of undercurrent of violence that really was affecting many women and girls before the pandemic even started. The problem is that when we had the shutdowns, all of a sudden, women who are living in violent relationships are stuck, 24/7 with their abuser, and they don't even have access to the safe place, which could have been work, or they didn't have a break from their abuser, and so it's really sort of exacerbated the risk for them, but it's also created barriers to the traditional avenues of support, right? Because you're not able to talk to your friends or get the kind of support and services that you might in normal times. And governments have recognized that, as have the movements, the services and support organizations that are in place for women who experience violence. And the response was actually pretty quick. When the shutdown happened, there was an immediate mobilization of funds to women's shelters and other organizations that support people who are experiencing gender-based violence. And that was great. But it also sort of exposed just how precarious that sector is, how poorly funded, how many barriers to support there are, especially for women in remote or rural communities. There really isn't equal access to services and support across the country. And so, there really is a need for a really intensive look at violence and harassment and gender-based violence. And a plan, and the women's movement has called for a national action plan to end violence against women and gender-based violence. It's actually something that has been out there as a demand for a number of years. And actually now there are steps being taken to put one in place. There's been a set of principles that the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for the status of women have agreed to. Now, though, it means the hard work of the jurisdictions getting together and actually sort of putting some concrete recommendations. One of those concrete recommendations that we've been really pushing is the ratification of a new international labor standard on violence and harassment in the world of work from the International Labor Organization. And while this seems like a pretty sort of vague thing, it actually is an internationally negotiated document that was negotiated between governments, workers' representatives, and employers' representatives. And it clearly states that everybody has a right to a world of work free from harassment and violence, which is really important because there is a lot of harassment and violence that goes on in the workplace. And you can even see now, with the pandemic, we've all seen videos of poor retail workers being faced with very angry customers who don't want to wear a mask, right? That kind of third-party violence is really on the rise right now. And so having some regulations in place and some policies in place to address this, and to recognize that nobody should have to go to work and have to face harassment and violence, right? We really need a sort of concrete plan. So ratifying that International Labor Convention would actually put Canada on the hook for taking steps to actively address these things. Domestic violence actually is a workplace issue as well. Something that we discovered a number of years ago when we did a study, and we did a national survey of workers on how domestic violence impacted them. And what we found is that 1 in 3 workers had experienced domestic violence in their lifetime, 10% within the last year of the time that they filled out the survey. And that they were impacted in a number of ways. 8% lost their job, 40% were prevented from getting to work, 54% had experienced the violence and harassment at or near their workplace. So it really is sort of following them to work. And so this is something that we've taken a real interest in addressing over the years. I think I'll move to wrap it up here. I will just say that right now, as we're heading towards thinking about what a new normal looks like, it's really what we're really hoping is that the government will approach the recovery with some of these key systemic barriers in mind, and really put at the center of its plans the women and other groups that are most impacted by the pandemic. We are still dealing with the same inequities. We're still done waiting. But now is an opportunity, I think, to start to put in place some policies, some legislation, some services and programs that will actually make a real difference in women's lives. And with that, I will see if there's any questions.
Carolyn?
Vicky, I just wondered, with what you were saying, is there the will to do this kind of thing? Is there, do you think? I mean, how is this going to be affected?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, we do have a federal budget coming up, and this federal government has really, I think, heard the calls around childcare. They've talked about it. Will they actually put the money down in the budget to make it happen? Don't know, but it's really, we are seeing, I think, a real groundswell of different voices calling for investments in childcare. But I really think that this is something that everybody should be thinking about, calling their member of parliament and talking to them. And then not just the federal government, but we have to work on our provincial governments as well. And our provincial government maybe is not as excited about universal childcare, but if enough people are saying, look, we have to make this happen and it's for the good of the economy, maybe we'll be able to make a difference. And probably everybody on this call has a story, either it's their story or the story of their kids, about somebody not being able to, to go to work or not being able to find childcare, or having to pay for childcare. Those are the stories that are going to make a difference with decision makers. So that, I think, is what I would really encourage you to just, pick up the phone and call your MP, your MPP, and talk to them about why this is important to your family.
Well, a Rotarian is the member's assistant for Greg Rickford in our riding here in Kenora Rainy River, who's the Minister for Natural Resources, I think.
I have more of a comment rather than a question. Right before I came on, I was reading my Canadian Lawyer magazine, and there's an article in there about the young junior lawyers and their work and home life balance, because an actual judge said in the court that you can't expect these junior lawyers to be working and doing evening motions and weekend motions when they're working from home and also taking care of their children. So it's interesting that judges are even picking up on this. And hopefully that's going to have a sway with Parliament if judges are saying, no, we're not going to hear these motions outside of work hours because these women have children to take care of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent point. I mean, the whole, I know that I'm certainly having a hard time working at home, supporting my two kids and their home learning, and one of my kids has a learning disability and requires a lot more support than I can give in the middle of the day, right, while I'm doing my job. It's a lot of pressure. And that is why women are dropping out of the workforce. We should be really worried about that right now.
Yeah, and I think it's especially challenging with COVID and the pandemic because it's a lot harder to blur those lines with home and work life now when you're working from home and you're taking an hour or half an hour to care for your child, and then you're adding on that time at the end of the day to finish your work life.
Yeah, we've really talked about, one of the things we've talked about is bringing in some employment standards around the right to disconnect. And to not be tethered to your phone all the time, to be able to have some time, to be able to set those boundaries. Not all workers are able to do that, and not all employers are willing to let them do that, right? And so sometimes government has to step in and do the regulating for them.
And then like on attracting women to run for office, like the House of Commons used to run until like 2 o'clock in the morning, like they have in the US. And I think I don't remember when they changed that, but.
Yeah, there's a lot more MPs with small children now. And I think that is actually helping change the culture in Parliament a little bit. The best thing you can do is vote for a young mom, right? Because they're the ones who are going to demand the changes. I ran for office, in 2006, I ran for city council. And about a month after I launched my campaign, I found out I was pregnant. And it was a 10-month campaign. So I got pregnant and I gave birth within the span of the campaign. And I actually encountered a lot of stigma, right? A lot of reluctance to vote for somebody with a small child. I think that that's changed though in the 14 years since then, because I see a lot more young moms really taking the leap and getting elected, which is really great.
They're not letting them nurse in the House of Commons though yet.
Oh, sure they are. Yeah, you can. That one has been dealt with for sure.
Len, you have a question?
I think Fred had his hand up just before me.
Okay. Fred? Go ahead, Glenn. Fred's muted for a change.
Okay. I just have a question on the statistics. You cited some statistic that said women are dying more due to the COVID, and I just want to know where you draw that from. The reason being is one of the hats that I wear is with Labor Council, and April 28th we do the International Day of Mourning for workers that are killed or injured, and so I'd be interested to. I'm imagining that this April 28th, COVID is going to dominate the conversations.
Yeah, well, actually, I just took that from the statistics that are published around death rates. There's demographics that are, it's the public health information, so you should be able to do that. I haven't heard yet what the theme for Day of Mourning is going to be this year, but I expect that it will be connected to COVID for sure. And when you think about the people who are putting themselves on the front lines, and not all of them have access to protocols that are going to keep them safe. Think about teachers, right? In small rooms with like my daughter has 30 kids in her class, right? It's when you think about long-term care workers and some of the equipment that they had to deal with, especially in the privately owned long-term care centers, it's pretty horrific, right? So. Yeah.
So our hospital this weekend just got 10 cases of COVID where people came in with negative and then later on tested. So they caught COVID in the hospital. And then the hospital itself is dealing with people who are working on multiple floors. So they're like working in different departments or working in corrections and at the hospital. And so like the hospital hasn't dealt with multiple workplaces and full-time work hours for the hospital staff.
And there's only one doctor that's fully vaccinated for the whole hospital.
Wow.
Although some have gotten one shot. My husband got his 2 weeks ago, but not his second shot. But it might be pushed to 4 months. Who knows?
Fred, do you have a question?
Yes, my question, Vicky, has to do with childcare. I happen to be a believer in childcare, and I guess paying for childcare spaces for couples where both couples work is I think a really good thing, and hopefully will become more prevalent in our society. But I guess my question is, when a couple decides that, okay, we want to have really good childcare for our children, we believe that one of us can offer that better than sending the children out to another institution. How do we compensate that couple so that they don't end up being penalized by having one less income in the family, and then being stacked up against all the two-income families? How do we work that out so that the one person in the couple who stays home gets compensated for the childcare? How does that work?
Well, I don't know if we really are set up to start to, it's not about, like, really, childcare isn't about making things even for people, right? It's about having a service there for the families that need it and want to use it. It's a choice, if a family wants to do that. What I will say is that any woman who stays home to care for their kids or takes time off to care for an elderly parent as well, because that is also a phenomenon that is really impacting women's lifetime earnings, that time needs to be credited for her pension, her CPP. I mean, that's the way, those types of social benefits, you shouldn't be, that's the way that women really get dinged, right? And so, yeah, I would say that, or men too, right? But 90% of the time now, I think it is changing with current generations, but nobody should be penalized in terms of their pension plan, right? Their public pension.
Yeah. Okay, going to call on Laura. If you could thank Vicky.
Well, thank you, Vicky. That was a very informative presentation on women in the workforce, and I think we can all agree that this topic was extremely appropriate for this evening's meeting, and also very interesting because while we all know that today is International Women's Day, a lot of us, and myself included, don't know exactly what International Women's Day means and where this day came from. So thank you for telling us about that. And so as a thank you for your presentation today, the Rotary Club of Kenora will be making a donation to the Rotary Foundation in your honor. So the Rotary Foundation does have 6 areas of service: peace and conflict resolution, water and sanitation, education and literacy, disease prevention, maternal and child health, and economic and community development. And by presenting today, you have helped Rotary continue to build towards and achieve these important causes in our society. So we do thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was happy to spend some time with you.